Pro-Letby campaigners say Dr. Evans relied solely on a medical paper written in 1989 by Canadian expert Dr. Shu Lee to back his theory that the babies had been injected with air because they showed discoloration or rashes before they died. Dr. Lee gave evidence in Letby's defence at her appeal, saying none of the rashes were characteristic of so-called air embolism. But Dr. Evans also included in his witness statements research from 18 other experts.
I presented 18 research papers discussing air embolus in babies, not just the one involving Dr. Lee. And I broadly played down the significance of the skin discoloration as part of the air embolus because the local staff had not realised its significance and had not documented the information at the time. So my diagnosis of air embolus was not dependent on discovering this peculiar rash described by Dr. Lee.
Right. Yes. First of all, just briefly about this paper. That is a paper by Lee and Tanswell, and it's probably the best-known paper in relation to pulmonary vascular air embolism in the newborn. It's published in 1989, so despite being over 30 years ago, it's a very well-known paper, and the other reason it's well-known for British paediatricians is it was published in the Archives of Disease in Childhood, which is a monthly academic journal that all paediatricians receive. So therefore, the archives are the most widely read journal from paediatricians. Anyway, so this is not some obscure journal, that nobody ever reads.
I presented 18 research papers discussing air embolus in babies, not just the one involving Dr. Lee.
And most important of all, I think, in this with regard to air embolus, as I said this morning, the paper we refer to most commonly is the one by Lee and Tanswell, 1989. There are very little new publications regarding air embolus in babies. That is not a criticism, that's a compliment. You can't produce research papers or publish papers on conditions that don't occur. And we have become obsessive, meticulous, throughout our careers in relation to avoiding getting air into the circulation of sick babies and sick children. So it's not a matter of having to apologize for quoting research papers that are 30 years old or more, nor is it a weakness, I believe, in quoting papers that involve just one case. For instance, one of the papers I published was from Pakistan, I think, where they don't do post-mortems. So therefore, the assistance that we get in the situation of this nature from research papers is inevitably relatively limited.
I broadly played down the significance of the skin discoloration as part of the air embolus because the local staff had not realised its significance and had not documented the information at the time.
No, there's nothing in the notes. I have heard all of this over the last couple of days, but it wasn't in the notes. But I heard the descriptions of this rash, and in my opinion, I think the rash can be baby A's collapse fits together, and is sufficient to make a diagnosis that his collapse was the result of an air embolus. In other words, air had somehow got into his circulation.
So my diagnosis of air embolus was not dependent on discovering this peculiar rash described by Dr. Lee.
All right. So the fact you say he was stable, I have asked you about that. Sudden crash, resuscitation unsuccessful. In fact, whatever point it is you turned your mind to it, you regarded discoloration as significant in his case, don't you?
Well, the discoloration,
Do you regard it as significant, Dr. Evans?
Sorry?
Do you regard it as significant in his case?
Well, if it's not my role as a witness to get engaged in what people call factual disputes. Those are matters for the court. If members of the jury and others accept what Dr. Jayaram and others say about the pattern of discoloration, the pattern of discoloration and flitting movements and the redness and the pinkness as well as everything else. If that evidence is accepted, that is what you get in air embolus.
And you base that upon what you've read, the description in the report by Lee and Tanswell, don't you?
Yes.
Right. So if I can summarize what you say there, I don't mean to do any disservice to it, but you are saying if what Dr. Jayaram says is right, and if it matches what you see in that report, then that could be supportive of air embolus.
It adds to the clinical diagnosis, yes.
So baby 1 was a case of air embolism. This was a preterm baby, twin 2 infant, who was born by emergency cesarean section. And he was well until the second day of life, when he suddenly collapsed and had skin discoloration with blotchy patches of brighter pink on a bluey-gray background. And he did not respond to resuscitation. The allegation was that baby 1 died from injection of air into the intravenous line, causing air embolism and resulting in collapse, patchy discoloration of the skin, and eventually death. So, to begin, I will give you a little bit of background on the publications of air embolism. The prosecution, in part, based their allegation on a paper that I had written in 1989. Where I described all 57 cases that had been published to that point in time. And it showed that the babies would present with a certain number of symptoms or signs, and also that about 10% of them had skin discolorations of different kinds. At that time, I did not distinguish between arterial and venous air embolism. And in this particular case, the allegation is that she injected air into the venous system, into the veins. So there's a difference between arterial and venous, because the arteries carry blood to the body to supply the organs and the skin, whereas the veins actually carry blood away from the organs or the skin to the heart and to the lungs. And in the new paper that I had published in December of 2024 in the American Journal of Perinatology, a copy of which will be in the summary report that you will receive, we actually separated the cases with arterial venous air embolism from the cases with venous air embolism. And what we found was that in the cases where air was injected into the veins, there were no cases of patchy skin discolorations ever described in the literature. So the notion that these babies can be diagnosed with air embolism because they collapsed and had these skin discolorations has no evidence in fact. All right? None of this actually has ever been described. If this is true, it will be the first case ever described, but it's never been. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that in the arterial system, when you inject air into the arterial system, it goes directly to the skin or the blood vessels, or to the organs. Whereas in the venous system, it has to go to the lungs first. And the lungs has a complex bed of very small blood vessels that filters out all the air bubbles if they come through, so that they don't actually get to the arterial system. Now, in newborn babies, there's a hole called the foramen ovale in the heart, which can allow the blood to actually move over to the arterial system. But it has to go against pressure, because the pressure in the arterial system is higher than in the venous. And so what we found in the literature was that there were no cases that have been described where, in fact, these skin rashes have occurred. So let's do away with that theory, all right? The notion that these cases are air embolism because they collapsed and because there were skin rashes has no basis in evidence. Okay, let's be very clear about that. So our conclusion is that baby 1 died from thrombosis and that there was no evidence of air embolism. Because in this baby, the allegation for air embolism was that, number 1, the baby died, we could not find a reason for it. Number 2, this baby had this collapse accompanied by these skin discolourations, which was consistent, with what the allegation was, with air embolism. And what we are saying is, first of all, the second reason doesn't hold, because air embolism by the venous system does not produce these kinds of skin discolorations. Number two, there is a plausible and reasonable reason why this happened, which is what I just explained. So for both those reasons, we feel that this diagnosis is wrong, that this is not pulmonary air embolism. In fact, this is because of thrombosis. When it comes to Dr. Evans' testimony and his opinions, I would ask you to ask 3 questions. First of all, the first question would be, if our panel found so many problems with the medical care provided by this team at this hospital, how is it that Dr. Evans found none? Because in none of the 17 cases did he even identify one problem with the medical care provided at the hospital. The second question I would ask is this. He seemed to be rather selective in his use of information. So if he wasn't selective, if all the information was used, in fact, you would come to a very different conclusion than what he came to. Just take, for example, the case of the hypoglycemia, where he said there was no sugar for 2 hours and the blood sugar grows, therefore it must be insulin. In fact, he missed the one important value, which was at 1146, showing that the blood sugar, in fact, did not rise. So was he just careless, or was it deliberate? The next question that I would ask is, even when there's an obvious cause of death, why did he go around looking for malfeasance? So I would ask you to ask these 3 questions and ask Dr. Evans that. If you can answer those 3 questions, I think you have the answer to your question.